once again, people in a small town are dying, and except for a old man and a young baby. So that's the story of the Andromeda Strain. I'm John Chang with Dan Edmonds,
Hello.
and I thought that in the middle of all this, one of the things that we're seeing, of course, is that the cities are the hardest hit during this pandemic and stuff, and it made me wonder that the trend up to now has been where people have been kind of somewhat migrating back into the cities and stuff and everything. And I'm wondering with a you know this lockdown and pandemic and stuff like that, if people going to just basically almost like try to get away from the biggest cities again, and then like because we saw like a lot of the things of like kind of small town USA being affected before this, where the Amazon effect, the Walmart effect on the small towns, but then now it almost seems like we're going to have an opposite effect.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, we've seen the sort of corporate powers come in and sort of grab or even kill off small towns. But now we're seeing this idea that would it actually be desirable to live tightly knit in a large city, you're in very close proximity, and also this idea that if you are going to have to spend a month or two out of the year in a house, would you want to do it in a small apartment, or would you want to have more space? It's that sort of quality of life question that comes into it as well. Which, I mean, I think it goes hand in hand with the idea of going on a cruise. Do you want to be confined in a small compartment where you might, potentially get sick with lots of other people in the same situation? So yeah, I mean, it does make you wonder what the future of, first of all, work life. Will there be as much need to live in a city? And then secondly, will people even want to live that close together in a city? And if not, will we see something where our Walmart becomes more kind of localized, or corporations try and sort of make more suburban style services, or will we actually see more neighborhood community style shops and services and local business maybe kind of flourishing more because there's that need of a more sort of localized service? Because the other thing we've realized, of course, is with this, there's a big infrastructure that goes along that's all been affected by this. We're very much a kind of a global network, and you can see how much we've been affected by this. Maybe more locally produced, locally run things may be less affected by pandemics or large infections going forward.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a combination because of how, on the one hand, like kind of people are going to need their local services now more than ever, but the other, you have like these mom and pop shops and restaurants and stuff like that, that they just don't have the cash reserves. They pretty much live paycheck to paycheck, and a lot of them have been closed these 30, 40, weeks on end. So other than the ones that maybe somehow they worked out a deal with the landlord that's going to keep their rents at bay for a little bit, I think a lot of them just aren't going to survive this, because they just can't afford to keep the lights on and stuff. And I have heard of like some different cases where they're basically doing the carry out service only, and that's providing some cash and stuff, but business is down overall. Like even with like some of that kind of replacing their regular business and stuff, but people for the most part are kind of making do with like just doing the grocery shopping and kind of filling up the cupboards and stuff, and then just avoiding like kind of going out unless they have to and everything. So it's a tricky balance. And the work thing, like you said though, it's interesting because we saw like kind of a lot of the big offices basically shrunk down since 2008 or so. A lot of big firms just basically downsized to basically some combination of smaller firms that outsource a lot of their work and stuff. And so I think it's really like a mix right now, like kind of that's some things that like were either existing before or are going to be struggling or just gone, and then other things like will start to thrive where before they weren't as much of a thing.
Yeah, I mean, obviously one difference you're going to see, I'm sure, is that the need to actually travel into work 5 days out of the week will probably not be the standard anymore.
Yeah.
And your places that you'll be going will be meeting centers, if anything else, where you'll actually just go meet people, or you'll need some kind of more advanced or better, just sort of conferencing technology than what you've got at home, or what you've got available to. But then it's sort of, you wonder, well, how are you going to set up all these kind of basically hot desks for everyone everywhere in cities, or large centers? And then I think that one of the obvious connections will be hotels, because already hotels are set up for conferencing, but you may find that old office apartments, office blocks or things like this might get bought up by hotels and made into kind of like, the Marriott workstation building or something like this. I can see a lot more of that kind of crossover happening, because they're already geared up for that kind of space to rent to people.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting kind of point, though, is that like we have like a lot of these co-working spaces that were emerging, and I haven't really checked in on it, but I'm wondering like kind of are these like kind of still being used right now? I'm guessing not. Like there's although different people do prefer a co-working space, rather than working from home and stuff. But I think for those folks, they would just kind of just assume, go, well, I could save a little bit of money and then work from home right now. Besides, like right now, we're not supposed to be out and about anyway. And then meanwhile, like you said, these co-working spaces may be in trouble. So then, what is the natural kind of, bigger fish to, absorb them, which be, like kind of like you said, the corporate hotels who especially specialize in that kind of, market of workers who travel about and work and stuff like that from different places and everything. So.
I mean, they already, a lot of hotels is already work travel anyway. The Monday to Friday people that stay there are going to be there on a conference or traveling for business anyway. So it's a natural extension, really, I think.
But yeah, overall, I think, there's still like, I'm sure, all of us been kind of reading like kind of, predictions of like kind of what's to come and stuff. And I think overall, it's like we didn't see so much all this stuff happening. And then I think for the most part, we have some ideas of how this is going to play out, but I think it's still like kind of, we just still, there's so many unknowns and stuff like that.
The only thing we know for sure is that European style, affection within a certain personal space is basically, Southern Europe is no more in that respect. It's the only thing I can think of. But yeah.
Yeah, that's a sad kind of change, because for me, like personally, again, different times I mentioned about my love for Argentine tango stuff, but that was actually one of the things that I really embraced about their culture. Like kind of is that, in fact, my teacher, like different times would joke about how coming to this country, like kind of when people meet each other, it's like kind of, it's kind of, distant handshake and stuff. And whereas, the Argentine culture is very much about, like you said, like kind of, you just always greet with, at least a hug, if not a kiss on the cheek and stuff. And, like sometimes I read these articles where like people kind of almost cringe when somebody's like kind of, approaching them to give a, PDA, a public display of affection and stuff. And I think that's something that is just going to be part of our, cultures, or the shift in culture going forward and stuff. So.
Yeah, it's gonna be interesting.
So yeah, I think what we started out with this one is, of course, the setting of the small town, and something that we've seen in these horror movies and stuff. And I think what's interesting is, Andromeda Strain is actually known as a genre-creating film, because the whole idea of a techno thriller wasn't apparently as, you had certainly like kind of war, politically driven ones like Failsafe or Dr. Strangelove and stuff like that. But this was one that's kind of like was a odd beast, so to speak, because we had, even though it had like more pure sci-fi as, with like The Thing and everything, but this one was the first one that was like a biological, agent that basically created this kind of, situations. It's this, this thriller and stuff. And I find that for us, as we've talked about before, it's interesting how there's some horror elements that kind of really surface right away.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, you've got a town full of dead people with buzzards circling. It's pretty morbid right from the get-go. I would say, well, certainly in the original, that's really the only thing, but they do kind of flash back to it occasionally.
Mm.
But it's still quite in your face to sort of, you know, make its point. And I think also, as you were sort of saying about the techno thriller, you know, this is actually sort of Michael Crichton's key to his success, really. This
Yeah.
idea of kind of taking genres that weren't necessarily taken seriously, and by adding, you know, a lot more thought into the science or the pseudoscience, depending on how you want to sort of actually break it down. But he kind of made it feel like, you know, this would be the most realistic case of if a you know some sort of alien bacteria landed on Earth, or if we managed to recreate dinosaurs using the amber from a you know the blood of a mosquito. It seemed, you know, the way he does it, it makes it feel quite sort of scientifically plausible. But I think that's really the key that differentiates him. And I mean, the fact that we even refer to them as techno thrillers and not just science fiction sort of shows you just how he managed to sort of carve that niche out for himself.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, you know, coming from his science background, you know, apparently he wrote this while he was in medical school. And it's interesting how his path was where, you know, he had the choice between medicine and writing and stuff. And the reason why he decided to, you know, go into med school was because he saw these thousands of doctors, you know, like kind of that were making a living and stuff, and only a couple hundred writers that, you know, like kind of, and so he basically did that as kind of like as calculus, I guess, if you will, of choosing, you know, like kind of which way to go. But then, you know, sure enough, though, he started kind of getting enough success with his writing that basically then he said, well, you know, I'd much rather do this and stuff. And I think that's, you know, like kind of makes sense in a way. But at the same time, what's interesting, though, is that because of he went that route, though, that gave him such a science technical background that's, like you said, what he really brings to his writing. And he's, you know, like having that solid foundation, I think, really makes it where, you know, like kind of when we go into a story like Andromeda Strain, you see the science foundation. You see like kind of somebody who, you know, isn't just kind of doing technical babble stuff, but he understands like kind of um, the science behind it. And also, what's interesting is apparently that like when he wrote the book, that he referenced these different documents and stuff like, you know, that made it seem real enough that even when the screenwriter for the movie basically like just took it as like that was actual references and stuff.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting that he made up his own kind of bibliographical references. That's a really interesting blending of fact and fiction.
But I think it's also, you know, another example of that. Like if he didn't have that kind of science background, you know, because certainly I'm sure in these years of medical school he did lots of papers and stuff. But he probably was used to how that language and the way that things were cited and stuff like that. That basically it became second nature for him to kind of just make something up and stuff.
Absolutely, yeah, no, and I'm, yeah, apparently a lot of, I mean, I was trying to think of a good example, but apparently some of the technical jargon in the movie is also sort of just made up by the guy who wrote the script. But I was trying to actually find a proper example of that, but I couldn't really.
Well, so one of the main things was this thing called the odd man hypothesis, right?
Yeah, I thought that was quite funny.
That an unmarried man would be better able to execute the most dispassionate decision than crises and everything. And the way they explained it in the movie, it made it sound like, you know, some kind of actual, you know, thing and everything. But apparently it was just made up just for this movie.
Yeah, that's quite. That would probably strike the wrong kind of chord. You release that now, I think.
Right.
Yeah. I think it's. Sorry, go on. Yeah.
I was gonna say the decontamination process, though. They spent so much time in that.
Yeah, that was a long decontamination. I mean, and even compared to in the remake, I mean, it's still like a good 3 hours when you add up both episodes. But I mean, they certainly didn't spend that long. No. I mean, it's the fact that they've got. I mean, I'm sure this is just for the sake of visual effects, but they've got different colors, you know, to mark it down, and then there's just sort of very bizarre sort of sequences like I don't know what's supposed to be going on with that Diamante helmet where you're naked and you get sprayed, or you get the xenon lamps burn you. I thought, yeah, that was kind of like a weird 1970s sort of touch. but yeah, and then of course being sort of seeing people vaguely naked through weird color filters was another sort of interesting thing. But it took a long time, and it was very rigorous in that respect. If it makes you wonder though, if would you actually need to go through all that, even if we were dealing with some sort of highly dangerous?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think one of the things that makes it a little bit more dated was I think that at that point they probably didn't have like as clear decontamination processes and stuff like that. Whereas nowadays, I think that like if you notice, like we saw this a little bit with the crazies, and the fact, like you said, the remake and everything, that the way that they do the decontamination, the suits and everything are very similar. I think because by this point, there's a lot of that they actually would use and stuff. And certainly, I think, like nowadays, a lot of us are used to on the news seeing like, so the same way, like, maybe before we had Vietnam footage and stuff like that. Nowadays, we're so used to seeing the footage of like kind of these people in hazmat suits and like, the processes of, how they like, go into an area and like kind of basically carry off a body or something like that. And so, for better for worse, we're kind of like, we've seen kind of these realities, and that, like the things that are portrayed in these, these more updated films with contamination and stuff like that. It's just, very much life imitating art or vice versa and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's it took them a very long time. And I like the fact that they had to sort of have more and more restrictive diets as they went sort of further and further into it. But I think the idea of it is that it's this idea of being highly isolated, and just like you would isolate something, that he's sort of isolating the characters as well. So you have this very claustrophobic environment, which is sort of them trying to escape the trap of the bacteria, like like they're trying to sort of almost escape the lab towards the end when they're no again spoiler alert, but blows up.
And I think that's where we kind of get into the areas where kind of the dividing line, if you will, between thriller and horror, because a thriller tends to be like, other than politics or science and stuff like that, is something that's more, I think, more present, or like kind of based more on kind of quote unquote reality. Whereas I think a horror tends to be based more on kind of the supernatural and things that like kind of like that we wouldn't so much explain away with science and stuff. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, I think the horror is more based on your kind of primal fears, and is tapping into that. It's a much more kind of immediate connection with the audience, whereas I think a thriller is very much, it's a time pressured scenario where you've got a sort of a specific problem that needs to be solved, more or less. It's kind of like the engineer's story writing, as opposed to the sort of visceral shock value kind of story.
Definitely. Yeah, that's definitely a classic element of a thriller, is that having some kind of time element. In this case, of course, it's a race against the clock. Once that they had the contamination with the virus, or the Andromeda strain kind of breaking out through the seals and all that kind of stuff, then they had to kind of stop the self-destruction mechanism and stuff. So there's the race against the clock there. And other times, like kind of, it's like a ticking bomb, I guess in this case, it is an actual bomb that's kind of has a ticking clock. But a lot of times these thrillers will have some kind of element like that, where it's like some kind of race against some kind of, clock that you see like counting down, literally, in a lot of cases.
Yeah. And I mean, I think what I quite enjoyed about the original was that this idea that you are just basically focused on the scientists, and you're following their method of how to isolate and possibly get rid of this bacteria. And so that you actually see them doing the tests, and they explain it in a way that kind of makes logical sense. Whether it makes any real scientific sense, probably not. But the fact that they through the dialogue and the performances, they actually kind of manage to keep some sort of tension and stuff, because ultimately, that most of this movie is just like four people in a room discussing stuff a lot of the time. You know, it's not really the most exciting
Right.
movie visually or in terms of action, but he does a very good job. I mean, this is Robert Wise. He's, you know, Hollywood legend who's done, you know, loads of really classic, massive
Oh yeah.
movies. And this is
Hey.
a very sort of stripped down minimalist kind of movie for
Mm.
someone like him to do. So, you know, you really, and I actually really like the fact that, you know, it was just focused on the scientists and they were quite realistic. You know, they didn't, so as we'll see in the remake, is a different story. But, you know, that, I mean, the scriptwriter fought for the female role in it, and for her to be, you know, a realistic representation, or how they felt of someone who would be, you know, a well matured scientist in their field. So I thought that was very good.
Yeah, apparently, you know, like you said, the screenwriter fought for it, and then, you know, like kind of the director, you know, as experienced as he was actually against it. And then what was interesting was that, like, ultimately, they found like kind of they got feedback from other, you know, actual scientists who like kind of, you know, praised the decision and stuff like that. So he kind of went back to like, okay, and then in fact, I think like you said, you know, she's probably one of the stronger, you know, characters in the ensemble and stuff like that. And you know, in fact, she kind of really adds some kind of, you know, color to it, to the group and stuff. Because otherwise, it's just these other guys, right? I mean, you know, we probably could barely tell, you know, like kind of who was who, like kind of, you know, like we know one was the elder kind of scientist and stuff like that, the leader of the group, and then, you know, like other than that, I mean, you know, they pretty much were like this kind of blur, I guess, of male scientists and stuff.
Yeah, two older male scientists and one that's slightly younger that we tend to see a bit more naked in the movie. So, yeah. No, and I think it's, you know, they do actually keep a good sort of thread of pace of tension regardless of all of these sort of things. So, yeah.
It's definitely that, you know, kind of the time element and stuff. And then I think what was interesting was that like as they kind of realized at some point that the contamination may be spreading and stuff, they had, you know, big spoilers that they decide to nuke the site. And I think that's something that we've talked about a little bit before, where at one point they still did think of the nuclear option as like a viable kind of like, oh, you know, kind of we could just, you know, strategically nuke a small site, whatever and stuff. Just a little nuke, just a few kilotons and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, just like the crazies as well. It was just, you know,
Right,
how do we deal with any kind of outbreak? Just nuke it. Simple. Yeah.
And then, of course, like, you know, one of the things they kind of mentioned was that, like, you know, actually, you're really not supposed to. We do have agreements not to nuke things. You know, other countries get a little touchy when we kind of just arbitrarily, even if it's on our own soil, they kind of don't like it when we are kind of just setting off nuclear devices and stuff.
I mean, if coronavirus had happened in the 70s, the first response would have been, surely we just need to nuke Wuhan. It's simple as that, really. Yeah. But yeah, different times, I guess. Yeah,
definitely.
I mean, one thing I did, I mean, there's quite a few sort of fun things that do date it quite badly, though. I mean, you know, the titles are very much like, this is going to be a classified and top secret thing because it's flashed in front of your eyes repeatedly.
Right.
And also just the sort of abstract electronica.
Oh, yes.
It's quite, I mean, that's quite fun. It's kind of, you know, this is the sound of science in the 70s. I enjoyed that quite a lot. And then, of course, we've got the CGI, which I don't know if you want to elaborate on that.
CGI, in quotes.
Cardboard generated interactive effects.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I remember around that time period, like, you know, in like, you know, 70s, 80s and stuff, like where, you know, if you did something like this, right, more than likely you would be kind of making a transparency. And I don't even, if you know, like if this is before your time and stuff like that, but I remember like kind of making these like slides that you would have, you know, like basically put on an overhead and stuff to project and everything like that. So, you know, from what I understand, this is like basically the technology that they were using, like technology and stuff. And it's funny how like to get these effects for like a computer, it's just using like kind of, you know, the equivalent of practical like effects and stuff.
Yeah, yeah. Apparently, yeah, they just sort of had layers of cardboard that had stuff on and removed it and had sort of light shining through stuff. I mean, they did it pretty well.
Oh yeah, yeah.
It was quite convincing, but yeah. Yeah,
and I
different
and I
times.
and I think that's what's interesting about a movie like this. At different times, they're, um, you know, creating this facade, if you will, or this idea of technology as they're seeing it, like kind of, like in other words, what they were supposed to be representing with Operation Wildfire was the state of the art laboratory that,
Yeah.
in the event of a, an actual biological disaster or stuff like that, they would have to, basically jump into it, and so they were basically trying to portray that it was something that like wasn't even made yet and stuff. And so they kind of try to, put this kind of these effects to kind of portray that kind of advanced technology. And different times we run into this with movies like Star Trek. Speaking of which, the director Robert Wise actually, was the director of the first Star Trek movie and stuff like that. So
Was he?
yeah, yeah. So
Oh, I didn't know that.
yeah,
Okay.
so sure enough, like kind of, it's interesting how different times these movies portray these kind of advanced technologies and stuff, and then sure enough, as we've talked about as well in some other these discussions, that becomes the reality. Like it's funny how like some of this stuff like kind of really captures our imagination, and I feel like in some ways that the suits themselves. I have no doubt that like it probably spawned somebody's ideas about like, oh, we're gonna need these hazmat suit stuff. That actually looks like something we could do, and they kind of model it based on so it's like that thing again about life imitating art.
Yeah, and I mean, having a positioning system that sort of can tell you where you are in the building, and
Mm,
things like this, security systems, cameras, etc. It's all stuff that was probably not very well. It wasn't at all common in the 70s,
no,
but is now commonplace everywhere.
yeah, just even like now, like of course for us like having like video conferencing is like kind of just it's a reality and stuff like that. And even then, like it's taken a while to kind of get to where just more than 30 frames per second was like kind of a challenge for the technology and everything. But
Yeah,
back then, like kind of that was like kind of like just beyond what like kind of that they could feasibly do without like kind of complicated like kind of television studio setups and stuff.
absolutely. And I mean, I think it's what's interesting at the moment with the coronavirus is
Mm.
that if anybody watching, or if you happen to have tried to use Cisco WebEx in the last sort of month or two, depending on how much load it is, I mean, it's just simply not working. There's so
Yeah.
many people trying to use these these conferencing systems, and we're so used to being able to say, we of course we have like high definition video being sent to every possible location in the world simultaneously. I mean, it's amazing the difference when you think of when you watch something like this, and there's people
Definitely.
with celluloid sort of slides, removing them with pieces of cardboard. How far we've come, but yeah,
Yeah, and it's funny how when we get back to the roots of it, like even though like we have things like Amazon and Facebook and all that, but the backbone of the internet was intended just for a instance like Andromeda Strain. Like in other words, the internet was not made for like kind of us to do like kind of silly cat videos and stuff. It was made for the fact that like in the case of a nuclear or biological attack where things are kind of literally the infrastructure is kind of in shambles and stuff, that we still have a way for us to kind of communicate like for our forces, for the commander in chief to kind of talk to the different kind of forces and stuff like that. So it's interesting how like that's sometimes we forget that.
yeah.
Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
Yeah, so we had a unplanned break due to technical difficulties, as they say. So we're back now, and I think we kind of covered pretty much most of the original Andromeda Strain. Looking at the remake, certainly like it's like once again we have the MTV effect. It's got all this slick um, visual kind of production value, not least of which of course is having a lead Benjamin Bratt, who like he's kind of really known as like kind of for these roles and medical procedural kind of television shows as the charming doctor and stuff like that. And then certainly we have in this case an added kind of angle is Eric McCormick as this nosy reporter, and who's trying to find out what the conspiracy that's going on and stuff like that. And of course, they had to give him a drug addiction problem, so just to make him a little bit more I don't know, interesting, I guess, or colorful character.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, my expectations for this went through a real roller coaster in the first couple of minutes.
Yeah.
Because I saw it was produced by Ridley Scott, or he had
Right.
some sort of Reddit, and I thought, oh, this might actually be quite good. And then within the first sort of couple of minutes, I realized I was, watching a steaming pile of Biohazard, and it wasn't going to go very well. I mean, was Nash even in the book, or like was there even a reporter character in the
No,
original? I don't think so.
I think it was all made for this version of stuff. I mean, we have to kind of consider that it was made for A&E, which like certainly has a certain kind of quality to it. So I mean, I thought overall visually, like it was pretty stunning. Like kind of just they had a lot of like great effects and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it kind of started off, like kind of on a good foot, like I don't know about like kind of if it was like kind of just going to carry it through the whole rest of it, and we'll certainly get into that. But like I said, the fact that like it was Ridley Scott did like kind of make it where it's like, oh, okay, I kind of maybe there's hope and stuff. Certainly in this case, they decided to show this teen couple actually discovering the satellite. And I guess that was kind of gave the impression that like, okay, they wanted to kind of spell some things out, which as we've seen different times with remakes, that's one of the kind of, I don't know if it's a cardinal sin, but it's like one of those things that remakes seem to love to do is basically spell out what things that were maybe left a little bit to the imagination in originals.
Yeah, I don't know if we watched different downloads of the same movie, but I thought the effects were pretty terrible from the get-go. Everything looked pretty CGI horrific to me.
Right.
I didn't get that, and it looked at I mean, I realized now, because I probably watched quite a lot of bad remakes, that there is definitely the key signifier of a TV movie is this need to basically explain everything as much as you possibly can about the characters within the first 30 seconds. Like, I don't know if you noticed, but like Dr. Stone's wife, whenever she picked up the phone or talked to anyone, she seemed to describe that entire person's character profile on the phone to them. Just like, Mr. Nash, the drug-addled reporter who always gets his story at the end. Or, my ex-husband, Dr. Stone, who's brilliant, but a real pain in the ass and uncompromising, but a Nobel Prize winner. It's just like, who actually picks up the phone and says, it's so and so and blah blah blah. So. And it's sort of like, you immediately meet their kids or significant others within the first 10 seconds of meeting the characters. And it's kind of like they try and desperately establish all of this immediately for you. So, that was kind of just screamed TV movie at me. And then the fact that everyone, like, there has to be like some of the most attractive scientists collected in one place at any one time. So that all kind of... the realism dove off a cliff for me pretty early on. And then
I thought that like like what's called they had Daniel Day Kim, who he's kind of like from Lost, like that. Viola Davis, I thought she's normally a really strong actress and stuff like that. I think in this case it was like just another one of the situations where they really underutilized her, and then like in fact. I felt like, as we'll kind of get more into later on stuff, that like they basically, it seemed like, I don't know, there's something about it, like different times that they love to do this with good actors, is that like rather than having them shine and stuff, they turn them into like shrieking, like kind of, just these hysterical characters and stuff.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I felt like she just about kind of escaped. She clawed her way out of this movie relatively unscathed, but it was pretty bad. I mean, for me, the one thing that was just I just couldn't stop laughing was the first guy, the drunk, who's the only survivor.
Right.
I can imagine him looking at the script and going, okay, so it's no, 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 no. But obviously, you know, dying. And they just kept, and it was just such a ridiculous scene that they shot of him. And this was this found footage bit. And then they just played it over and over again, this terrible kind of like sort of death or dying scene. And then with the same with the pilot who's there sort of screaming with the terrible CGI as a thing sort of disintegrates. And it was bad enough first time. I thought, please don't make us watch that again. And then like 2 or 3 times again, we're seeing the, you know, and I just thought, oh, they just really didn't know, didn't know when to not, you know, restraint was definitely missing in this one. So yeah, and I mean, I was also just like, I mean, compared to the original where you've got the scientists methodically going through and the tension building of how they're going to solve this, you've got like, you know, the scientists are working out, they're having coffee, they're talking about their college romances, and it's like, well, you know, there's an emergency going on, and yeah, they've got, and they don't actually seem to be doing any science. It's just mostly them standing around in a room kind of chatting, and all the women seem to have all their tops undone to, you know, it's like there. It's like, this isn't science, damn it.
I mean, you know, certainly they, you know, I think one thing they did, like, kind of to compensate for the original was that the decontamination scene wasn't nearly as, like, kind of painful and stuff like that. But the downside, though, was that, like, you know, like I said, that, like, there was more this kind of, you know, casual effect then of, like, kind of, in other words, you know, like, in the original, you did get a sense of, like, kind of how serious it was a situation that they were going into this bunker to basically be locked in with the disease, you know, this contamination and stuff like that. And whereas, like you said, in this remake, then it kind of like was like, you know, like, oh, it's kind of like some
sexy phone party rave, basically. It was just like, you know,
getting back
like,
together,
like slow motion, getting all sprayed over with foam. It was, yeah, I don't know.
I mean, you know, I guess for me, like, what I thought was like kind of the cool effects and stuff like that was like, you know, little stuff like where they had like e-paper and you know, like kind of drones and stuff like that. So like, in other words, some of the stuff was like kind of, they did show like more current and also like kind of a little bit more forward thinking as we talked about with the original and stuff. And so that I thought was like kind of, you know, like that they did well. And then the other thing is, as a military pet peeve, I guess, different times, like, one of the things that you hate as a military, you know, anybody who's had any kind of experiences like that, is that, like, when they get the wrong, like, kind of airplanes and you know, the jets, like, in other words, they'll have a Navy jet being flown by an Air Force guy or vice versa and stuff. Yeah. And so in this case, they actually didn't, you know, but then, you know, then of course they got that right, but then meanwhile they put this, you know, hysterical actress into, you know, like a fighter jet that somehow is supposed to convince us that, like, that's how a trained fighter pilot would behave under duress and stuff like that. And I'm sorry, you know, like, kind of, if anything, you know, like, okay, yeah, you get points, you know, a couple points for putting a female pilot into this scenario. Then you get -4 or 5 points for the fact that, like, you have a hysterical, you know, actress portraying that role and stuff. And it's certainly like, I've seen, like, kind of, you know, some other situations where they have had female pilots, and they're a lot more realistic than this poor actress stuff. I mean, she was clearly just not, you know, I don't know, it was between the casting or the direction that she was given and stuff. It was just like, you know, like you couldn't ask for a worse combination, I guess.
Yeah, I also wonder, like, is it normal in the military for, you know, the commander and officer to conduct all of his conversations with a 6-inch gap between his face and the person he's speaking to? Because it seemed like Mancheck, whenever he was in shot, he was like literally this close, like with the president or anyone, he's like talking right at them. I thought, surely there'd be, you know, if you're dealing with a contagion, you know, you're completely sort of going against the common sense here.
Right.
But I mean, also, like, you know, Daniel Day Kim was, they set him to sarcastic in this movie. Like, every line he had was kind of like sarcastic. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, you know, like, kind of, I think it's interesting where, you know, as we talked about also before, that, like, different times these actors, we have like associations and stuff, and I definitely, from his role in Lost and stuff, see him as an actor who's, like, much more capable of, more than just sarcasm and stuff. And
Mm.
yeah, he was, again, I think overall we just had like these actors who just really, at best underutilized or like just not used in their um to
Yeah,
get
not
the best
used.
performances out of them.
One of my favorite bits from that was the bit where they're talking about the satellite. Now, bearing in mind, he's been introduced as a sort of microbiologist
Hmm.
at this point, as an
Right.
expert in viruses and germs. And they're like,
Hmm.
so what kind of satellite was this? And he's like, oh, well, it was this kind of thing. It's like, well, hang on, why do you know about satellites? You're a microbiologist. And then later on, Benjamin Bratt asks him, so wormholes, what do you know about them? And he goes, well, I'm not a physicist. No kidding, you're not. You're a microbiologist. Why would you know anything about wormholes other than general stuff? And for me, that was like, I mean, it's this kind of heavy-handed environmental kind of
Mm.
cudgel that comes down on this remake. And yeah, like wormholes are best left to Stargate Atlantis, I think, rather than something that's got a heritage in being scientific and
Right.
measured.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder why they went there and stuff. Because certainly, like, kind of like this is again, this gets into the lessons more discussions we've had before. That in the original, they kind of like left it as ambiguous as to kind of where they picked up, this the Andromeda Strain itself. And here, they I can't even explain or why they would possibly have like this explanation of a wormhole and stuff. I mean, in the context of the story, okay, like kind of like yeah, okay, that then drives the fact that like it's something kind of really you know like they've never seen before stuff. But I think in the original, just the fact that like they weren't sure and they were able to kind of figure out some things was enough. Like kind of like it's as you kind of said that sometimes they just felt the need to over explain things that like really didn't need to be explained and stuff.
Yeah, or just yeah, they would have just. I think really the problem with this was it was a collection of quite interesting ideas of how to
Mm,
do the remake, but just executed really poorly, or
mm.
not really them knowing how to make the particular ideas develop them into sort of interesting scenes more than anything else. Um,
And then other
yeah,
times, like kind of when they, just intentionally made it, like kind of more interesting stuff. And big spoiler alert, like where they got down to like kind of that if they had to have the thumbprint and stuff, but then meanwhile the character who, somebody needed, like kind of gets dramatically killed and stuff like that. Poor Ricky Shroeder. Um, they, like he's they don't make it where he hands him the thumb or like they had to do this bizarre like toss that was like out of some kind of sports movie where you had the
yeah.
miracle throw and stuff.
It was yeah. When we had the flying severed thumb, I thought, hang on a minute, is this actually a comedy? Have I just read this all wrong? It was such a ridiculous scene. But there was lots of bits like that all the way through the movie that I just thought this is just so ludicrous, and I didn't stop laughing the whole way through. To be honest with you, I actually really enjoyed it in that respect because it was so bad. It's been a while since, and likewise, it's like we were saying with Thomas Crown Affair, it's nice to see a really good remake. It's nice to
Mm.
see a really abysmal remake like this, in my opinion, because it's a lot of fun.
I mean, I don't know. I guess I felt like up to the halfway point, it had potential to kind of be something that like was like at least really enjoyable and like a remake worthy of the original, like if nothing else and stuff. But when they got into like kind of Birdemic territory, like the one scene where like you had these flock of like CGI birds, and it was like like it was as bad as Birdemic, if not like. And
Yeah.
meanwhile, like Birdemic, right, is known for the fact that like it was bad, like it was intentionally bad stuff, and the fact
Mm.
that like it was a low budget kind of production and everything. And here, everything else up to that halfway point was like I felt like kind of like it had potential, it had like something going for it. So
Yeah, I don't know. I lost faith a lot earlier. I think there was a lot of dead birds in this movie. That's what made me laugh. And I couldn't tell. Some of them looked like, yeah, and maybe they were CGI, but they almost looked like they were on strings or something. But maybe it was just bad CGI. But there was a lot of dead birds and burning bunnies with flamethrowers as well. It's like,
Right.
but I mean, but you know, in terms of shock factor, I mean, you know, that just shows you how ridiculous this remake is. But I mean, in the original, the scene with the rhesus monkeys and the rats,
Oh, right.
I
We
had to
didn't talk
look
about
up whether
that.
they actually killed those rats and
Yeah.
the monkeys,
Yeah.
because
Same here.
but I found out they just basically starved them of oxygen and then had to
Right.
resuscitate them after
Right.
this after the scene. So, but I
Right.
mean, it's that scene of the rhesus monkey is probably the more shocking than anything I found in the remake, to be honest with you. But
Definitely.
yeah, no, and just I mean, the other thing that got me was, so you know that they've got some college romance between you know, I can't remember the name of the character now, Benjamin Bratt's character Stone and her, and it's this is like after they've been there for like an hour, and they're talking about something, you know, just idly chattering during a national emergency,
Right.
and she says, "Why are you telling me this?" And he's like, "I don't know, because I'm lonely, I guess." And it's just like, what? It's like you've been there 5 minutes, and now you're trying to like throw a romance sort of thing in the middle of like this global threatening alien virus. It just made no sense to me. I mean, I suppose, I think what was nice about the original was they kind of took this idea of a sentient alien life form, but they didn't kind of like hammer it home. In this one, it was like, you know, they were scared to talk about it in the same room in case it heard them and started, you know, the bacteria started sort of like, you know, conspiring against them. It just seemed completely ridiculous in that respect.
That was a really strange direction to take it, and it was just like another one of those of, you know, like, why did they go there? Like, kind of, you know.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, overall, like, you know, I thought that, like, and again, why I thought that, like, there was potential was that they kind of really, when the moments that they did something kind of that moved things forward, you got the sense that there was paranoia, you know, like, kind of, you know, it was military versus civilians, government versus, you know, the military, and, you know, like, it was just overall everybody was like kind of, and I felt like that was something that, like, they had potential to kind of work with, to kind of really show how in these crises, different times, again, man is his own worst enemy, that, like, they tend to, like, kind of really get in their own way. In fact, in the original, they kind of touched on that, and I think that they didn't really even dive into that nearly enough, of this idea that different times, like, it's a comedy of errors. That, like, we saw this a little bit with the crazies and stuff, where that they did have the cure, but then meanwhile, you know, like, kind of because of the chaos that ensued, they weren't able to kind of get it, you know, into the right hands and stuff. And so in this one, in the remake even and stuff, I felt like that's something they did do better than the original, actually, to a degree. And then it just kind of, once they started kind of really doing the kind of weird explanations and stuff, it just totally degenerated, unfortunately.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right though. I think you know, Michael Crichton stuff often plays on this idea of counterbalance of human ingenuity and ambition, you know, counterposed with, you know, human error, just like one little slip up. Like, he goes through all of this thing with, you know, explaining in great detail the wildfire lab, and then it's just like a piece of paper gets stuck in the communication thing, which means they missed the fact that there was no nuclear strike. So, and it's, you know, things like that. I'm sure in Jurassic Park, it's probably just like a human error that lets the dinosaurs lose. Someone probably just turns a gate off or something like this, you know. So I think it's you know, that's quite an interesting angle he has in his stories.
Yeah, and you know, certainly that's one of the, you know, kind of classic science fiction theme of, like, kind of, you know, different times, like, technology goes awry, because it's just, you know, human beings pushing the boundaries until it gets to that point. Like, in other words, you know, the whole idea of Icarus, right, where he kind of flew too close to the sun, and in fact, that's kind of different times one of the main like in just about any sci-fi story and stuff, it's this idea that like we're kind of constantly pushing the boundaries of, like kind of what we're capable and stuff like that, and then oops, like kind of, but the other interesting thing too is that like like I think in both cases though, the original and the remake, the actual agent, the Andromeda Strain, is actually not man-made. And before I saw these, actually,
Yeah.
I had the impression that it was man-made. Like I thought that was the idea of it. Like in other words, what my impression of the story was that like it was some kind of science experiment of a biological weapon that they kind of accidentally broke loose and stuff like that. I didn't really realize that what in both cases it was like kind of them trying to find something alien to the planet to use as a biological weapon and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know if they say that's kind of one of the potential things, but I think the idea is it's just there to sort of, if you want to take them, the motivation's a bit more innocent. They're just there to try and see if they can find life on some other sort of asteroids or something like this. But I think what was so sort of interesting about the original was, or for its time at least, was this idea that alien life didn't have to be green little man. It could just be like a bacteria.
Right.
Or intelligent life could even be a bacteria or crystal based, which was a very sort of interesting concept. I'm sure at the time a lot of people hadn't thought of that. And this, the remake suffers from this idea that, we must change something about this. So let's make it man-made from the future to protect us from destroying our oceans. It's just like, sorry. And if you're wondering, like, I mean, when they said, vent mining at the bottom of the ocean would be, great, endless resources, I thought, really, mining stuff at the very bottom of the ocean, that seems to be like the most energy inefficient way to get resources that there possibly could be. And also I looked up the bacteria and it is a real thing.
Oh yeah, that part's real.
Yeah, it's definitely not going to sort of fight off any alien bacteria anytime soon.
Yeah, on the other hand, like you said, the environmental theme could have been something that was made this a worthy remake and stuff. That like if they weren't so heavy-handed about it, it's just something that like they could have handled well, and like because certainly like kind of there are things like that we are doing to our environment stuff that simply like kind of to say that it's a harmful to our humankind and stuff like that is really an understatement. But on the other hand, it's like like to basically make it like the that like kind of we save this bacteria, therefore it'll kind of save us from aliens. It's like that there's probably other reasons to kind of just to keep that bacteria alive and stuff that you don't have to make it like kind of this kind of God pill, I guess, if you will.
Yeah, and I get the idea. It's kind of like they're sending a time vaccine back for us because it's got this coded message in. But I mean, what if people didn't figure out the message? Then it would have just like killed everyone. It's a very high risk strategy. Couldn't you have just sent back, a USB stick or something? Wouldn't that have just saved a lot of time? Instead, just don't do vent mining. Or have something that proves that you are from the future or something, and then just it seemed like a bit made for an exciting story, I guess, but not a terribly realistic one.
And I think the other thing that was kind of just I don't know, not even sure what to make of it, was the fact that like they had like kind of this not quite Illuminati, but like kind of this
It was it's very much you see that in a lot though. I mean, we've said this before, the 90s and the 2000s is like throw a conspiracy in there, that's the way to throw a new angle on it. So that was in there obviously. The other thing that was kind of interesting though was the fact they said that the NSA is listening to all our conversations, and then roll on Edward Snowden in 2013 and so they are. So that was kind of interesting because I'm sure you could have interpreted that as being a very sort of heavy-handed conspiratorial note, but yeah,
I think overall, like probably what it was that like they were looking to pack on things to make it like the almost 3 hours long and stuff. Because it was a miniseries. That like then they threw in like kind of the nosy reporter, and I mean I thought that part they um, it's again like kind of just like many things, great ideas, but just the execution left a lot to be desired.
Yeah, I mean, I just felt like I really just found the whole thing so funny. I mean, I like the fact that also one of the side effects of this new
Mhm.
version of the Andromeda Strain is that it makes the people go mad within seconds, and they just start randomly gunning down people as they go in and get their morning coffee. I
Oh, I
mean,
forgot
it's
about
that.
that. Like,
Yeah, I mean, it's or just
th-
there's lots of just people going mad and shooting each other.
and had this 28 days later theme music, right? That like you just could swear that that's really what they were driving at too.
Yeah.
They were very much going after the rage virus effect and stuff, and then but meanwhile, like uh, I mean, if that was the effect and everything, then it just kind of like it felt like what it was like they were trying to combine like many different things, because on the one hand like in the original they actually explained it, the virus was mutating because it was kind of absorbing things that like that it was kind of changing things from matter to energy to matter and stuff like that,
Mm.
and so it was adapting and stuff, and they explained it that way. But in the remake, then like they did have that aspect, but then they had to, like you said, throw in the fact that like then it made people act violent and stuff, and so cue the
Mm.
28 days later kind of theme and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's actually what's quite clever about the original as well, is the fact that it just turns benign at the end,
Right,
which
right.
sort of which actually makes you feel like the heroes really they didn't really do much to prevent this. It just kind of did it by itself. But
Uh-huh.
it kind of punctuates this thing of like our control over nature, or how we can predict
Mm.
what's going to happen, even with our 5-layer
Mhm.
wildfire. So it really is
Right,
completely useless. We have very little control over what happens in these scenarios,
right.
as is being highlighted right now in real time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's not like the heroes saving the day like it is in the sequel, in the
Yeah.
remake. Sorry.
And when you think about it, that's kind of why I was like getting at that. Like, it's interesting how the the harmful effects, what it would have happened was because they that the wildfire sender itself exploded, right? That like
Mm,
like then it would have released like kind of, so in other words, nuking it, all the different things that they were planning to do themselves, in fact, and then in fact in the end almost ended up doing to themselves, were the very things that would have like kind of done more harm than good.
yeah.
Because like you said, like in the end, it was just the fact that like it dissolved more or less, like kind of and so it just went away as a problem. So maybe in fact, as President Trump says, like in the end, we're just gonna have a miracle and everything will just be fine and stuff. So
Absolutely. Positive thinking. Put a picture of everyone healthy on the fridge and look at it every day, and we'll all be good.
certainly it'll be better than injecting ourselves, I guess, with disinfectants. uh,
Yeah. So yeah. But I would highly recommend, in some respects, I actually kind of enjoyed the remake more than the original, just because I just had a real good laugh watching it. So I highly recommend anyone go and watch that. It's a fun 3 hours.
but so I think what's interesting also is that like here we have the beginnings of Michael Crichton on his path to kind of because even though we talked about Westworld before,
Hmm.
that actually was yet to come for him in terms of his work and stuff, his writing and everything. In fact, Westworld was his first time directing. Like kind of, and then certainly subsequent to that, he kind of did other films and various evolved and stuff.
Well, I think from what I understand was he had a few sort of misfires with books, and then he was almost like
Mm.
hired to write either a book for the screen,
Hmm.
and then was that's how he got the money, or how he got the sort of the publishing hype for some of his books. So there's a
Right.
very sort of close connection between him directing and making things for the screen and
Hmm.
writing books. And so it makes you wonder whether after Andromeda Strain and Westworld, whether he just basically wrote most of his books with the idea that they could also be films or had source material that you could pull on for films. So
yeah, definitely. I felt like, having read some of his other work, the books themselves did feel like they were written for the screen. So
yeah.
so it's almost like he was doing the adaptations before, they actually were made into movie and stuff. Like versus the other way, where typically we see these movies that are adapted for novels. I mean, I feel like in some ways that was probably like a trend more in the '80s. We see less of that now. I feel like that we don't see as many um, adaptations to novels after a movie is made.
Yeah, it's true actually. Yeah, that was a very big thing, wasn't it? I mean, I remember when Star Wars and various other things
Yep.
came out, you always wanted to get the novelized versions
Right.
of them. Yeah, it's definitely not a thing now. It may be that there's now we have so much choice, and
Yeah.
the different sort of types of media have established themselves more that we know. When I read a book, I want a kind of like a book experience, and when I want to, watch a movie, I want a TV experience. Probably because it's all so much more available these days than it was in the late 70s, early 80s. You'd have to go to the cinema, and then it wouldn't be on any but VHS for like a year or two afterwards. So you needed something to fill the time.
Yeah.
Whereas now it's like, you've got to wait a couple of weeks or something. It's out, so yeah.
And speaking of Westworld, definitely we'll be revisiting it. In fact, tonight, as we speak, the next to last episode will be on, and so certainly we'll keep our fingers crossed that we'll be able to kind of cover it for next week or the week after and stuff. And yeah, definitely, that's definitely one of the ones that we're looking forward to discussing. Any thoughts as to kind of like just since the previous Westworld seasons and stuff, what you're looking forward to? And
I'm actually interested to, because we're doing a kind of a Westworld redux from this was one of our first videos, so this is going to be quite interesting for me to see where we've come from when we first started doing these, and also how my opinion on AI has changed. But also, I want to watch some of the TV show Beyond Westworld, because I'm curious to see if they've picked out little bits and pieces from that and Futureworld and actually kind of like, woven them into the actual TV show. Because there's already a few sort of bits and pieces that I've noticed that I thought, oh yeah, they've kind of stolen that little idea for the TV show. So yeah, I'm going to be interested in watching those. Yeah,
apparently the TV show like basically ignored the future world and stuff like that. So I thought that was kind of interesting that like basically, we see this sometimes with, like Halloween, like where they would basically just ignore some of the sequels and stuff like that and treat it as if, they were non-canon. I think that's one of the things that like has evolved over time is that like we have this idea of canon and non-canon and stuff. So yeah, definitely be interesting to see like you said, what things they consider Westworld canon and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't watched any of the Westworld episodes yet as well, so I'm also interested to see how, Jonathan Nolan and his wife's attitudes towards AI have changed in the last sort of year or two. So
awesome. So yeah, once again, thanks for watching. John Chang with Dan Edmonds, and we will see you next time.